Hello, friends. Today I am going to talk about the 7 books that I have read so far towards the 2026 Fantasy Subreddit Book Bingo Challenge. If you are not familiar with this challenge, I will leave a link below to the full rules. But it is a bingo board that the subreddit publishes every year on April 1st with 25 different prompts. The challenge is to read a fantasy, sci-fi, or speculative horror book for each prompt, and you are not allowed to repeat an author, with the exception this year for the duology prompts. You may repeat the author for duology part 1 and duology part 2 if you do not care about hard mode. Which brings me to hard mode. Each prompt has a hard mode version that adds more restrictions on what you can select. I am personally not fussed about doing hard mode, though I might use it as a tiebreaker. If I'm trying to decide between 2 books and one needs hard mode and one doesn't, I will choose the hard mode one. But if you are watching this video potentially seeking recommendations for your own attempt at the challenge, I will try to mention when a book does meet hard mode, or I will also try to mention if I know that it would fulfill any of the other prompts on the bingo board besides the one I am choosing to use it for. So with that, let's get started. Since April 1st, I have read 7 books that I will be counting towards the challenge. The first book I'm going to talk about is The Works of Vermin by Hiron Ennis. I am using this for the trans or non-binary protagonist prompt. I read this book for a book club at work and I gave it 3 stars. I saw reviews of this book that called it biopunk, and I think that's a good description. I hadn't heard that before, but it takes place in this world where the city is built into, I guess, a giant tree stump of some kind, and there are giant bugs that need to be exterminated. So one of our main characters is an exterminator who is in a lot of debt and is trying very hard to keep his sister out of debt. Another one of our main characters is a perfumer who works for the upper echelons of society because her perfume is kind of magical and perception altering and kind of enables a kind of subtle mind control. So the atmosphere in this book is really impeccable and the setting is really cool. I think maybe it's a little underexplored for my taste, but this book isn't really that interested in the world building in the sense of like guiding the reader through all of the logical implications about how this world works. But it is really more just like atmosphere setting, and it's like interested in these questions around class disparity and power. And there is this like, yeah, there's so much atmosphere. There's opera. Opera's a huge part. There's bugs, there's poisons. It's pretty cool. But where I really struggled with this book was that it's just really difficult, I found, to get your bearings. It is in some ways intentionally confusing and ambiguous because the author is building this mystery and this payoff at the end. And I think if you like that kind of book that has like a big payoff at the end, you might like this one. But I found the prose itself was also often kind of overly complicated and difficult to follow in ways that were not beneficial to the plot or building the atmosphere. I was glad that I got to talk about this book with my book club because in the first quarter of the book, I was like, yeah, it says the city is like a tree stump, but I can't really figure out what that means or what the layout of the city is. And I wasn't the only person that was confused, but some other folks jumped in. They were like, oh, no, no, I'm pretty sure it is a tree stump. So the city is in a tree stump. And like that kind of cleared up a lot. So I think I was very willing to read things as metaphorical or atmospheric when in fact I should have been taking it more literally. And so that was just kind of confusing for me. And I would say, like, overall, this book is not really my taste in book, but I would recommend it if you think this setting sounds cool to you or you're very comfortable, like, living in some ambiguity and you like reading books that feel like a puzzle that you're trying to solve. But I would recommend reading this with your eyeballs if you have that option, because I think part of the reason I struggled so much with like confusion was because I was listening to it and I couldn't backtrack easily. So I think physical book is the way to go with this one overall. Also, if you are considering reading this one, this book would also qualify for hard mode of the politics and court intrigue prompt because there is a prominent focus on politics at the city level or lower. The next book I'm going to talk about is I used for the translation prompt. I read On the Calculation of Volume 3 by Solvay Bala. Hard mode is that the book was first translated into your language within the last 5 years, and this does qualify for that. This is book 3 of a planned septology. 6 books have already been published in Danish, and they are in the process of being published in English, as we speak. The series is about a woman who is stuck in November 18th. So she keeps reliving the same day over and over again. And each volume is pretty short and meditative, and these are not plotty books. The action of the book is pretty mundane, but our knowledge of how the time loop works just is slowly building over each volume, and it is very philosophical in the way it's written. It makes you reflect on what it means to be in stasis and what are we clinging to for comfort and security, and what would capture your interest and attention if you were in this scenario. And just the way that the author is like squeezing out so many interesting ideas out of this premise is really fascinating. And they're quite novel ideas too. Like I think we're all familiar with like Groundhog Day, but like the approach in this case is so different from anything I've encountered before. So I'm still really enjoying this series, and I would recommend it if you are into timey-wimey stuff or fiction that's on the more literary end of the spectrum. My next book, though, is as genre as they come. I read Startide Rising by David Brin, and I rated this one 4 stars. I think it qualifies for hard mode on the unusual transportation prompt, and I'm not totally sure, but I'll talk through it. But even if it didn't count for this prompt, it would definitely qualify for the Explorers and Rangers prompt, and the non-human protagonist prompt, and the First Contact prompt. This is classic space opera sci-fi. So yeah, I think it'll help to talk about the premise first, and then I'll talk about how I think it fits the unusual transportation prompt specifically. So this book is part of David Brin's Uplift saga, which is set in a universe where galactic civilization is built on patron species uplifting and genetically modifying pre-sapient client species until they become sapient. And then the client species is typically indentured to the patron species for 100,000 years. But humanity is unique because they seemingly uplifted themselves, and they got to a level where humans started uplifting their own client species, which are dolphins and chimps, by the time like they were discovered by other alien races. So humans uplifted themselves and other species without seemingly a patron of their own. And for various reasons, other alien races don't really like that they did that, or they don't really believe that they were actually independently uplifted. They think maybe another species like started the process and then abandoned them. I don't know, it's pretty interesting. But Startide Rising is the second book in the saga, but it does stand alone, and it is the first and only book I have read from the saga. So I could follow along just fine. Don't be scared because it's marked as number 2 on Goodreads. But in this book, we are following an Earth spaceship crewed by mostly dolphins, a handful of humans, and 1 chimpanzee. I guess these are neo-dolphins and neo-chimps because they've been genetically modified by humans at this point. And this spaceship, the space crew are running away, hiding out on a water planet, trying to repair their ship because they discovered some pretty important information and everyone else wants their hands on it. All of these other alien species are chasing them to get their hands on it. So let's talk about the unusual transportation prompt. The prompt reads, the story includes a surprising method of moving from place to place. By unusual, we mean that it is out of the ordinary in real life and uncommon to the book's broader genre. This can include a highly unique take on a genre staple. So spaceships with faster than light travel wouldn't normally count, but the infinite improbability drive from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy would count. Or it could be a completely original mode of transit, autoducks in the Undertaking of Heart and Mercy, for example. Hard mode is that transportation is not combustion powered or steam powered. If the power source is not stated, use your best judgment. So, in terms of how the human spaceship is powered, it's like some kind of faster than light space travel, but the spaceship is part water filled so that the dolphins can live and work without having to put spacesuits on. And so I think that makes it qualify for like not your typical sci-fi spaceship. And it is also unusual in universe in that most alien races just build spaceships using specs from the Library Institute, which is the repository of basically everyone's collective knowledge. Because why would you reinvent the wheel if other alien races already figured out the best solution to the problem of building a spaceship? But the spaceship in this book is something humanity developed on their own, so it is unusual in universe too, because humanity is like, well, we understand how our spaceships work, and we haven't had a time to read your all your library specs, so I guess that's why they just are using their own spaceships. But overall, I I think the concept of this series is really cool and really thought-provoking. There are some aspects of this book that have not aged well, including the most problematic for me was that there was some workplace sexual harassment where one of the dolphins in the crew were harassing one of the female human crew members. And that's kind of treated in a dismissive way in the book that is not acceptable by today's standards. Yeah, it was just definitely lessened my enjoyment. But the universe and the adventure inside the book is really fascinating. Next up, for the 5 short stories prompt, I read Seasons of Glass and Iron by Amal El-Matar, which meets hard mode because it is a full collection of short stories. These short stories were previously published in other venues, but I'm sure her publisher wanted to pull these together for readers now that Amal El-Matar has more name recognition from How We Lose the Time War and The River Has Roots. And I think she writes really well at this short story length. I gave the collection as a whole 4 stars. In the introduction, she talks herself about how one of the themes that appears in a lot of her work is women talking to each other. So we see a lot of female friendship and sapphic romance and feminist retellings or reimaginings of fairy tales. A lot of her short stories are in that fairy tale mode of writing, which is not necessarily my favorite kind of fantasy mode, but she writes so beautifully at the sentence level that I really enjoyed it regardless. But I think my favorite short story in the collection was actually The Green Book, which is a woman trapped in journal, sort of light horror story. So really good, 4 stars, and I recommend checking it out if you are a fan of her other work. Next is The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu, which was another book club read, but this time it was with Charlie's book club on Fable. I'll link Charlie's channel below. I am counting it for the Cat Squasher Square, which is just a prompt for a book over 500 pages, but it could also definitely count for Politics and Court Intrigue, Unusual Transportation, and Author of Color. This is not a book or series that I had on my radar at all, but I really did enjoy it and I liked reading it with the book club. This is another 4-star for me. I found out after the fact that this book is heavily based on, it heavily reimagines the events of the Chuhan contention in a fantasy setting. And it is definitely a story that tries to follow like grand arcs of empire and revolution, and it has this very historical tone. It is fantasy, but it's not extremely heavy on magic, though there is a pantheon of gods that can intervene indirectly that were pretty cool to explore. The fantasy of it all is more that it takes place in a secondary world that has different impressive feats of engineering. Things like airships and war kites are really important to why the Empire at the beginning of the book was able to overpower like other previously independent nations. And I really enjoyed the thought and imagination that was put into engineering as military and political strategy. My critique of this book was that when we zoom into the individual characters and players, the dialogue between the characters wasn't always very naturalistic. The way they would talk about their motivations and strategies did not feel very realistic and kind of pulled me out of the narrative. But it works more in the mode of like, it's a kind of this classical epic mode that considers big questions of war and patriotism and honor. And so, speaking of classical epics, the next book I'm going to talk about is The Odyssey by Homer. I read the translation by Daniel Mendelsohn, and this was my first time reading the Odyssey in full ever. Didn't have to do that in school. So, what I actually wanted to read it for, I wanted to read it before Christopher Nolan's adaptation comes out, and I'm glad I did. I am going to count this for the game changer square. That prompt is that the story features a game or competition, and I think that I might otherwise have a hard time filling out this prompt, but there is an archery contest towards the end of the Odyssey. But I think this would also count for older protagonist or duology part 2 if you consider the Iliad to be a part 1, or it would count for translated, obviously. I gave this book 3 stars. I am glad I read it because it is so ingrained in our culture, but it is definitely the kind of classic that I appreciate more than I enjoyed. I did listen along to the Overdue podcast's deep dive where they were reading Emily Wilson's translation, and I thought that was really good. I really enjoyed listening along with that because this is the type of book that benefits from allowing yourself to go through it more slowly and catching up on the historical context. And that podcast is really great too because they really appreciate the funny and strange moments that bring some levity to the reading. And so grateful for that podcast that I was able to listen along to. And then finally, my last book, you can use one reread on your bingo board. So I am going to use my reread of Guards by Terry Pratchett for the politics and court intrigue square, where it counts for hard mode because there is a prominent focus on politics at a city level or lower. This is where I originally started with Discworld, and it's also the book I would generally recommend other readers start with. And on a reread, it is a 5-star book for me still. It is such a funny parody and deconstruction of kings and tyrants and heirs with magical swords and city watch guards that are just like there to die in most cases. It is hilarious, but it is also wise about how it depicts power and greed, and that's just peak Discworld for me, although I still have a ways to go in finishing all of the Discworld books. That's a project I'm currently working on very slowly. But that concludes my first update on my fantasy bingo progress for 2026. I will put up the image of how my board is looking so far. If you are watching this because you are also doing this challenge, I would love to know how it's going for you so far and what your favorites are. I have ideas for the remaining prompts on my board, but there's very little that I'm extremely committed to, so I could be easily swayed by a personal recommendation if you have one. And so until next time, happy reading.